So today our topic is peak oil and transition and all that that entails. And our special guest with us today for the hour is John Duvall. He's a PhD who teaches cinema production and screenwriting in communications and the media studies at the Dominican University of California. He produced the documentary Peak Oil and Transition, which for his doctoral dissertation at the California Institute for Integral Studies. And we'll be talking about that quite a bit. Dr. Duvall formerly edited sound effects in Hollywood and writes feature screenplays. Welcome to our show, John.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, you've had a lot of learning. You've been through a lot of programs. You've got a lot of experience with communications. And I guess for your doctoral dissertation, you produced this video, which I've seen. Bing, have you seen it?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, it's on YouTube, and it's called Peak Oil and Transition, and it's full of material. So maybe we can start talking about that a bit.
Yeah, and we'll list it on our website.
Yeah, it's a video that I think is well worth the hour and a half because it's so comprehensive. So, John, what made you take on this project?
Well, it's an interesting story. I needed to get a PhD in order to be eligible for tenure at my university, and I teach in the area of film production, but my hobby for these many years has been involved in reading about peak oil and the transition movement and so on, and so I thought in order to do something for my dissertation that would encompass both my vocation and my avocation, as it were, I would do a documentary video on peak oil and the transition movement. And so that's how it came to be. This is what I call a no-budget documentary because I don't know if this is a confession or not, but I used my school's equipment to shoot the film. And so all I really spent on the film was the tapes to record and the gas to get around. And so it was about as low-budget a documentary as you can possibly hope for.
Well, the key ingredient was your wanting to tell a story here. I mean, we can tell that this is a labor of love, and you put a lot of time into it. So I wouldn't minimize the expense from the commitment standpoint. This is one of the videos I see where I know so many of the people because you've captured a lot of the groups and leaders in Marin County, Sonoma County that we locally identify with sustainability, with transition, and various other folks. And you start out with Angelo Antoni, who is someone we've interviewed, and we know that he has been very strong on driving the peak oil message. And I think you start off making that strong pitch of, let's take peak oil seriously.
Yeah, well, Andre and I have a history. We, along with Jonathan Freeman, founded a very, very short-lived group called Post-Carbon Marin, which we only were active for a couple of years, but we made presentations to local business leaders, to city council and city council members, and also to the board of supervisors of Marin.
Right.
So we tried to play the role of a consciousness-raising group for community, political, and business leaders. And then the transition movement came along, and Sustainable San Rafael was going fine, and so we just kind of decided maybe we had fulfilled our function, and we went our separate ways. But Andre has been active. He has a post-peak living website, of which I'm sure you're aware, where he has classes for people to start to deal with their own transition problems, raising food, various sorts of things that people might need to do to be prepared for, a peak situation.
Yeah, and I remember, I want to say, I was at that County Board of Supervisors meeting where Andre made his pitch.
There.
And our supervisor, Steve Kinsey, and others were listening, but in the end didn't feel like and they asked for a recommendation, and Andre gave them about getting ready really for peak oil as a county to keep services able to be running and stuff, having some oil reserve plans and stuff like that. And in generally, it was dismissed, just like I think our society dismisses the facts. And in the movie, though, you have various experts, including Richard Heinberg, speaking to the facts of peak oil. Let's talk about that for a second.
Well, I want to give a nod to the late Charles McGlashan, who I think was responsible for bringing our group in front of the Board of Supervisors. And the loss of Charles is almost unmeasurable in terms of local politics. He was the most conscious person of the reality on the Board of Supervisors, of the reality of the situation of peak oil, and he was not afraid to think about what sorts of emergency management measures and other sorts of sponsoring or facilitating the development of local energy, sustainable energy. He was just a very, very rare public servant, and I feel his loss every day.
No kidding. And one of the legacies he leaves is the Marin Clean Energy Project, something he championed. Along with, as you're saying, he wasn't afraid to speak out. So few politicians, I find right now, are willing to discuss this subject for fear of being marginalized or, looking away from the fiscal cliff for just a second.
Well, that all goes back to Jimmy Carter, and when he said that our energy situation was the moral equivalent of war, and he proceeded to get trounced in the presidential election. I think ever since then, politicians on the national and the local stage have been just afraid to deal with these sorts of questions because they're afraid it's political suicide. However, sooner or later, as these things roll out, as the changes happen, they're going to have to be addressed. And
well, we're seeing some of that with Hurricane Sandy waking up politicians.
Yeah, and I'm finding that when they can translate it into economic terms, all of a sudden they pay attention. So with the Storm Sandy, they say, okay, that's $80 billion of damage, or whatever the estimate is. They can quantify it, they can stick it into their economic model, and now they're dealing with it.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. One thing that when I'm dealing with a climate change skeptic or a peak oil skeptic, I often point to the fact that if you look at the people who have to deal with the most immediate real-world consequences of these phenomena, it's the military, because they have to be able to function in a restricted fuel environment. But the military looks at climate change and peak oil as very real problems. And if you look at the studies they're having both in the United States and also in Germany and other countries, this is something that those people obviously believe in. And also insurance companies. Insurance companies have to survive as businesses, and if they're insuring people in areas that are, geographically threatened by climate change, they're going to raise their rates.
Right.
And so, that's one way of approaching these issues with people that are skeptical about their reality, is look at the people who have to deal with the effects on the ground. They're not skeptics at all.
Well, we do get these openings now in the political dialogue because the way we're financially against a wall, the way there's been an expectation of get back to more growth, get back to that growth thing, as if we're going to grow our way out of this problem. That reality, I think, is more and more setting into people that that's not going to be the solution of the future, is to just more economic growth.
Yeah. Well, my conception for the overall outline, when I teach my speech students in speech class about speeches about social problems, there's a sort of a problem, cause, solution procedure that you go through in talking about any problem. And so, I started the video by posing the problem about peak oil, explaining what peak oil is, what it's not, in terms of it's not the end of oil. It's not that we're going to run out of oil. There'll be oil in the ground hundreds of years from now. The problem is it'll be too expensive to extract.
Or the good news will be a little bit.
Well, right. Anyway, so I tried to spend about 15 or 20 minutes clarifying what peak oil was, and then I went on to what the aspects of peak oil might be on society, economically, in terms of, I try to take it in order of, our first problems will probably be in the transportation area, because almost all of our transportation runs on liquid fuel, and there are no ready substitutes for airplanes or large trucks. Earth-moving equipment, things like that. No ready substitutes for oil that I'm aware of. So, transportation will be immediately affected. Also, Richard Heinberg's done a great job in his book, The End of Growth, explaining why the economy will be immediately affected, because not only does oil provide, something like 40% of our total energy use in society, but in addition to that, the almost everything that's produced or transported or so on and so forth, oil involves something like 90% of the productivity of our society. don't hold me to these statistics. I'm not a number cruncher, and I have no.
No, it
claim
isn't
to
about
be.
the absolute numbers. It's about that relative punch that oil has that no other energy source has. Yeah.
But once you realize how pervasive the influence of oil and oil prices is in society, then you realize what a huge impact, $7, $8, $10 a gallon gasoline would be. And so then I talk about some of the psychological aspects of I think it's Rob Hopkins, who's the head of the founder of the transition movement,
Right.
talks a lot about our energy consumption in terms of the addiction model of psychological behavior. We're addicted to consumption. We're addicted to going out and buying things.
Well, all this power that oil gives us, I mean, it really has created something where we're unbelievably rich in terms of what we're able to do as a society.
Right. One of the great examples that's used over and over again is how much energy you get out of 1 gallon of gasoline will transport a car, 30 miles. And if you had to do that with human labor, it would take 2 years of human labor to do that. And so you realize how much the productivity of society in terms of energy consumption is enhanced by oil.
We take that for granted. Just on that point of the example you gave, when you buy a car, the engine, they tell you how much horsepower. And if you think about that, is if I didn't have this car, I would need that many horses to do what I'm doing here.
Yeah, right.
I think you would slow down.
Yeah, somebody who's in horse breeding is probably pretty well fixed for the transition.
Wow. Yeah.
I always look at, when I think about psychology of peak oil, I always think of the 5-point grieving model that comes from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross about denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. We're moving out of the denial, as a society, we're moving out of the denial phase about energy shortages and into the anger and bargaining sections. Anger is blaming the government, blaming the Arabs, blaming anybody but yourself, as a consumer, blaming somebody else for the problems, oil companies, government, etc. And then the bargaining is what Richard Heinberg would call searching for a miracle, looking for the magic of alternatives.
Right.
Surely with all these, whether we can use tar sands or tight oil or shale oil or all these magical other fossil fuel
and nuclear
or for that matter even solar or wind or geothermal. I mean, Post Carbon Institute, which is has the main goal of studying the impact of peak oil
They do
on
an
society.
incredible job of communicating.
Their research to date indicates that no combination of alternatives, and even putting aside for the moment of climate change, and everybody knows, I think, that any sorts of fossil fuels, whether it be natural gas or tar sands or anything, are still bad for the environment. Although there is a relative scale on how bad for the environment, but no, the Post Carbon Institute says that no combination of alternative fuels, be they fossil fuel based or not, or sustainable renewables, no combination of those fuels is likely to replace the efficiency of oil.
Yeah, and I believe that, but I think I'm in a very small minority. When you said, you think we've moved beyond denial to the anger phase, I think most people don't want to believe that and therefore don't believe it. They do believe that there's going to be a technological breakthrough, that the magic will happen because of belief in human ingenuity and how we've always done it in the past. And I think in the video you capture that one point where there's a difference between technology and energy.
Right.
We've been relying on this cheap energy source and really have exploded our technological capabilities to take advantage of this powerful energy source. But when that energy source goes away, no amount of efficiency, no amount of ingenuity can really make up for the loss of the original solar energy that took millions of years to get to this punch.
Yeah, well, among the what you might call the technological utopians, there are kind of two categories of people. There are the people that just have a blind faith in human ingenuity, that we've always done it before, we'll be able to do it again. There are also people who are very embedded in technology, whether it's hydrogen research or research on algae or research on various other forms of alternative energy. And I'm not saying that some of these things don't have great promise. And if we had half a century to develop some of these alternatives, we might be able to make it through this transition relatively seamlessly. The problem is we don't have half a century. We've got, probably a decade or two. And what I can't get away from is that I think we're going to hit the wall on oil before any of these alternatives are scaled up to the point that there's an infrastructure to actually support their use across the broad society. So that's where I part company with some of the technological utopians who I talked to a guy in Thailand who worked for one of the major oil companies, and he was saying, hey, algae is going to solve all our problems. And I was saying, is that next year or the year after? It's like, no. Yeah. Traditionally, most of the technological revolutions across society, whether it be from wood to coal or coal to oil or oil to whatever is coming next, those transitions have usually taken about 40 years to really go from where like when we went from coal to oil, we started switching over some of the major technologies like shipping from coal to oil in the early part of the 19th century, but it was the middle of the 20th century, early part of the 20th century, I'm sorry, I misspoke there, when Winston Churchill changed the British fleet over to oil from coal. But it took almost to the middle of the 20th century before oil was, provided more than 50% or around 50% of the world's total energy resource. And, it's going to take decades to get from where we are now to where we have the majority of our energy provided by any sort of alternatives. And if you discount the fossil fuel alternatives for reasons of managing climate change, that leaves you with, solar and wind and a few other things, and maybe nuclear, depending. Nuclear is a whole other issue, and there's a lot of debate about nuclear, not only in terms of the safety aspects of it, in terms of the waste products or the possibilities of producing nuclear weapons and things like that, but also the expense. Richard Heinberg, I'm almost done here, but Richard Heinberg doesn't think nuclear is a feasible alternative, not primarily because of some of those ethical objections or whatever, but just because it takes over $10 billion to build a nuclear plant and almost $10 billion to deconstruct a nuclear plant. And then you throw in all the delays from regulations and everything, it's just very, very hard.
Well, it goes to his core of energy return on energy investment. And so many people want to just compare that once I have my electric car, I own it, I can start counting the energy that it takes and its effects on the environment. And so the same idea is there are energy sources, but it takes so much energy to get them that in today's market it makes no sense. And then clearly uranium as a source for the nuclear is also a limited resource. It could also at best be seen as transition. So we talk about transition, but most of that is saying how do we continue our lifestyle as we have it and find replacements for the fossil fuels that are renewable that allow us to continue that lifestyle. And I think that's a denial in itself, because people are not recognizing that we cannot continue with all that we have in our culture, in our society, without this cheap form of fossil energy.
Yeah, Bernie, I'm so glad you brought up that point on energy return on energy invested, because if there's one point that somebody comes away from this hour of discussion with, I want it to be the understanding of that principle of energy return on energy invested, because we're hearing a lot from the energy companies right now talking about how we have, billions and billions of reserves in tar sands and tight oil and tar and oil shale and so on. And what people don't understand is that it takes so much energy and so many resources, natural resources, to get this stuff out of the ground, that to talk about reserves in this sense, compared to reserves of standard crude oil, regular old-fashioned crude oil, is comparing apples to oranges. It really is, because in the early days of the oil boom, the energy return on energy invested was something like 100 to 1 in the turn of the century, from the 19th to the 20th century.
Yeah, when it was just gushing out of the ground, It was 300 to 1.
Right. Get out under pressure. It's like you only had to put one unit of energy in to get 100 units of energy. That's almost a perpetual motion machine, you know.
Right.
And now, even now, conventional oil is down below 20 to 1. So we've lost 80% of the efficiency of oil just because we're having to get it 5 miles out to the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. But then if you go to the tar sands and tight oil and things like this, the energy ratio comes down like 4 or 5 to 1.
Yeah.
Which is something like 5% as efficient as the early days of the oil.
And
boom.
even at that, we're not taking the full cost of those in terms of their environmental impacts into account. Those are just the real costs of capital being spent in our development, as we call it.
Yeah. This manifests, this switch over of types of oil was manifest in the fact that about 5 years ago, the people who measure energy production switched over from the classic crude oil production to what they call total liquids. And they basically they merged the production of conventional oil with unconventional oil, disregarding the fact that those unconventional oils are, only about a quarter as efficient as the classical crude oil was. So it's really comparing apples and oranges, because if you look at total reserves, the reserves in the ground, and compare those reserves to conventional crude oil reserves, you're talking mostly about something that will never be economically affordable to extract. The other thing about this is, from an economic point of view, the valuation of most of the oil companies on the stock market is based on their reserves. So if you say my company, if I say Exxon has 1 trillion gallons of oil or barrels of oil in reserve, and I include in that tar sands and oil shale and so on, half of that will never ever be extractable economically from the ground. So I'm really overestimating the value of my company in the stock market by about 100%. I mean.
Well, in this kind of lying, earlier you were talking about industries that are well aware of the costs and the impacts of climate and what oil and fossil fuels are doing to us. Well, the oil companies know it too. I mean, the executives within them are probably some of the first places where they dealt with Hubbard's Peak and dealt with really what is their future. It's just that their interest isn't in us switching over before they've sort of milked every ounce of what their industry is about. Yeah. And they keep looking for other centralized kinds of form of fuel. Like the fuel production that we rely on today, be it the electricity or be it the gas in our car or everything in between, comes through highly centralized processes. Mm-hmm. And there is no such money to be made from very decentralized, localized wind, solar, biomass, and these things at a community level. There's not that same constituency. So we have people holding on to their power, and they really help in the keeping our American public from really understanding the facts, right? And so part of what I think has happened is, as we've had economic downturn, some of these impacts that we will be seeing have been delayed. And so people who have been skeptical have been felt reassured in their skepticism. But see, you predicted this 5 years ago, John, and it hasn't happened yet. And then when you listen to daily news, the concept is, well, stock market went up today, gas prices went down today. See, it goes up, it goes down. That's what the public is living versus this reality that you're documenting about.
There's an interesting relationship between oil prices and the economy, because I don't think I've been very wrong about many points on peak oil, but there was one point I definitely was wrong on, and that's that 5 years ago I thought that oil prices were just going to keep going up and up and up and up. And I didn't account for the fact that when the economy goes into recession, partly because of those higher oil prices, then consumption goes down and the prices go down. And so, a lot of people will point to the fact that since oil went down from like $150 a barrel in 2008 to whatever it is, $90 a barrel now, that means peak oil theory is wrong. And that's not an accurate analysis of the situation. It just there's a reciprocal relationship between the price of oil, or I guess you'd say an inverse reciprocal relationship between the price of oil and the strength of the economy. So oil goes up, the economy goes into recession, oil prices come back down again. until the economy stabilizes somewhat and starts to go up a little bit, and then oil prices start to go up a little bit with that, and then eventually we'll reach a point. I have a theory, and I haven't read this anywhere else, so I could be talking through my hat here, but I have this theory that it's not economical to extract tar sands or tight oil if the price of oil goes below $80 a barrel. The price has to be high enough to make it affordable to extract those reserves. On the other hand, if oil goes much over $110 a barrel, then it starts to push the country back into recession. So I think that the goal of the government and the oil companies combined is to maintain a price of oil somewhere in that margin between $80 and $110 a barrel, because that's where it's got to be in order to make the unconventional oils profitable.
Yeah, there's an aspect to that we might want to bring into this, is that a carbon tax, we've talked about it from the standpoint of climate change and helping to bring the costs of climate change onto the source of the fuel that it starts with. And it would also have this impact economically of more recession. So I think the reason we haven't seen a carbon tax and the reason we keep subsidizing the oil industry is because we're all, in our politics and our institutions are all linked to that system. So it's all perpetuating the model we know and then trying to milk that model into the future. And really, until that collapses, this belief in that system will continue.
Well, the word tax, people have a knee-jerk reaction to the word tax in our society, and it's been proposed that we have a revenue-neutral carbon tax in such a way that we tax carbon use, but then we take the taxes that the government gets through those taxes, the income, the revenue, and then feed that back into, say, tax breaks for people who are putting solar panels on their house or buying a hybrid vehicle or something like that. And I know there are some people, I think the hardcore core on the peak oil side says that that wouldn't work either, that we just need a flat out carbon tax and reduce carbon and not worry about what happens. But as a political point, in order to sell something like this, I think you almost have to make it revenue neutral to make it acceptable to the broad public as a
that's the problem. It's that which is passable in law is insufficient. So our political system isn't ready for hearing the truth about real. James Hansen is now saying over, and I watched him on one program say, carbon tax, carbon tax, carbon tax. As far as he's concerned, that's the single best thing if we're going to try to do something as government. But we recognize that the government is probably too invested in the current system to really make those changes. So your film does go into the area of what is the solution, and you were taking us on a path of your construct. So let's continue.
The last third of the film deals with the transition movement, and for those who are not familiar with this, about 2004, 2003, somewhere around there, Rob Hopkins, who was a graduate student in Ireland at the time, when he found out about peak oil, he rather than dwell on the negatives and be pessimistic, he wanted to see, well, what can we do about this? How can we react in a constructive, positive, creative, even enjoyable way to deal as a society and its communities with the challenges of peak oil? So he came up with this notion of the transition movement, which is basically a bottom up rather than a top down. Rather than ask what government can do for us, it's a bottom up, and in that sense, I think in some ways politically conservative movement, which says on the town basis, on the city basis, on the county basis, you need to try to develop more resiliency for your community. And that comes basically in the form of the first things first, providing food, providing energy, providing maybe medical care, providing employment for people within a given community. And this can only happen at the community level because every community is different. Communities have different water resources. They have different energy resources. They have different political, environments. And so the transition movement is basically a relocalization focus to provide community resilience. And what's happened over the last, say, 5 or 6 years is that this movement has kind of spread worldwide. So there are now in America, I don't know, something like 150 transition towns or something like that. I may not be up to date on my numbers, but in each community throughout the world, and there are a lot of these in Europe and others in South America and Asia and so on, there are groups who have founded transition initiatives. They're called now transition initiatives in order to help relocalize, food, water, energy, so that if there is a widespread cultural collapse, that community will still be resilient. It will still be able to withstand the impacts of a broader cultural collapse.
Yeah, no, I think it's very important that you made that the end focus of your program about where can we go, because that's what people are looking for. And I know what draws people to the transition movement is that they paint a positive picture of what can be, and we need that sort of an image to move towards. I just wanted to add to what you said about Rob Hopkins. He comes from studying permaculture, and
right.
We have a lot of people who've studied permaculture here with Regenerative Design Institute in Bolinas, and recognizing that you don't fight nature, you don't overwhelm nature, you work within nature when you're doing your food production, when you're doing your buildings and constructing. So it's more than just this place. It has actually an underpinning that is about how can you sustain permaculture permanently, and it's sort of the antithesis of monoculture. Monoculture is, of course, with crops, we talk about it in agriculture, having only corn or only soy or only wheat, and then having that highly technologically productive and efficient. Take all of that which is non-resilient. We really have very resilience today in our communities. So when you talk about holding on to resilience, it's really building resilience, because the communities are relying on stuff from across the ocean and across the country in terms of our energy, our fiber, our food. We're not really able to produce it locally. And lots of people are working on lots of aspects of that. And this is really a nice way to have people gather around from their various efforts to say we're all working towards that same future.
Yeah, have you had Penny or Jim from RDI on the program?
We've taken her class and we've had her in the program.
Yeah. I'm certainly not an expert on permaculture, but that's an important concept, because permaculture started, I think, at the level of the household or the farm, and looked at how to design the production of food and plants on that particular locale, in order that the stuff that needs to be most accessible is most accessible, right. And the stuff that
zoning,
the zoning principle, and we need to think in terms of urban design. We need to start thinking in terms of that, how to apply those zoning principles to our communities as a whole.
I want to add one more thing. You mentioned Penny, and we were at her place there interviewing a young fellow who was traveling from Cuba, who reported on his experience where when the Soviet Union could no longer and did no longer supply Cuba with their energy sources and their food sources and all that. And they had a team from Australia that was a permaculture team come in and help teach them those methods. And within short order, that entire country was able to grow its food and really adapt to a new reality that in many ways portends what we can look forward to. If we were cut off in that same way, would we be able to organize ourselves to continue a good life different from how we have it now, but definitely a much better life, many people would say. That is where we are moving a little slower, we're taking time to do things, and we're living locally and not driving these long distances. I know you talked about transportation before. Mm-hmm. Really the answer to transportation is to not need it. It's to be living where you work and exchange goods and buy goods and get your education and all that. And that means really a community becoming more self-sufficient again.
Yeah, there is a great film for those of you out there who haven't heard of it called The Power of Community, which is about the transition that Cuba made in the 1990s. I was in Cuba. I went to Cuba in summer of 2010 for a academic study group,
Ah.
perfectly legal, academic study group studying sustainability practices in Cuba.
Cool.
And what I came back from Cuba with, and it was a sort of a life-changing experience for me in some ways, because there's a lot of anti-Cuban propaganda here in the United States, and I wouldn't want to defend the communist system of government or anything like that. They could use elections down there once in a while, but I mean they have elections. But anyway, let's not get into that. But one thing that what impressed me about Cuba is they really, as a society, put first things first. They prioritize education, they prioritize healthcare, they prioritize food production. And while they still do import a fair amount of meat and grain, they're pretty much self-sufficient in terms of fruits and vegetables. And they have a lot of urban gardens. I visited one of the urban gardens right outside Havana that's famous. And, they have an approach to government and to social organization that is different in a poor Latin American country compared to a country like the United States, which has a vast number of resources and a vast wealth.
Well, it's because they don't have the tractors anymore that they had to adopt methods that then put more labor into food production. We have gone the other direction of having less and less people involved in our food production. We got to go back the other way, where it's not about the technology of GMOs or the technologies of tractors and harvesters and all that. It's about hands in the field and learning again these methods and seed saving that will really sustain us. That's where the real resilience will come from, is when we rely on that for our community.
Yeah, there was one kind of hard lesson that I did learn on my visit to Cuba involving human psychology, and that's that when the crash hit in the 1990s, most people had to resort to bicycles or to mass transportation because they couldn't afford cars, couldn't get the gas for cars. And since then, during the last decade, Cuba's made some sweetheart deals for medical care with Venezuela to get Venezuelan oil, and they're also doing a little bit of offshore oil drilling themselves through I think companies from Spain and Canada and the like. And what I saw was they are drifting back to auto transport. Now that they have more oil, they're using more oil.
Sure.
So it just drove home to me the fact that societies don't make these changes until they have to, and if they can go back, they will go back. So even in a society like Cuba that's had the experience of real hard times and also has a central planning sort of government, even in those circumstances, you just can't. People will do whatever they can. I mean, in Cuba, like more people have gone to motorbikes, for example, and they may have ditched their bicycles, but they've gone to motorbikes, so they're not driving cars.
Yeah.
But they're still driving motorized transport. So it's. I don't think I would tend to agree with you. I think what your perspective is, people won't change until they have to change, and I think that's probably true.
Yeah. Well, your video is one that everyone should see, but unfortunately not everyone is going to see it. And I don't know, I wish...
It will not be playing at a theater near you.
Well, but it's not alone. I mean, you are part, and actually you have another project where you are in the process of documenting about these kinds of videos and movies being made. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, my current project is I'm writing a book about environmental documentary filmmaking. And this book should be published sometime in the second half of 2013. That's this year now. And what I'm trying to mainly look at the activist environmental films from the past decade or decade and a half. The book begins with a little bit of historical survey about environmental films of the past, the beginning of documenting the environment on film, things like the films made under the FDR administration, The River, and The Plow That Broke the Plains, that talked about some of the environmental crises of the 30s that led to the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, which ironically was just reprised by Ken Burns in his PBS documentary.
I watched that. That was good.
Yeah. So I talk about, and Walt Disney developed some nature films that were sort of idyllic, but with a scientific edge in the 50s and so on. And then moving up to the present day, when there's been a lot of environmental documentaries, most notably in Inconvenient Truth, and then Gasland, and other documentaries. Many of them
Into
about
suburbia.
Well, there have been feature films like Inconvenient Truth and Gasland that are 90 minutes long and played in some theaters and won festival awards. And then there are a lot of under the radar films. I mentioned The Power of Community about Cuba.
Yeah.
End of Suburbia was a big one. These are little, like, short films, a little bit more or less than an hour long, and they have spread by being shown in church basements and in people's living rooms and things like that.
Well, Bing showed them around West Marin. I know that's how we really got started here, is showing those videos to the community.
Yeah. Those two, The End of Suburbia is I think, a seminal film in terms of the influence of documentary filmmaking, because, it really had an impact. That's one of the things that I try to look at in my book is, do these films really have impact or not? Or are they just kind of like, nice, speech making from environmentalists? And some of them notably had impact. Certainly, End of Suburbia had an impact. Inconvenient Truth had an impact on people's perception of climate change. There are some other films in other countries. There was a film called Waking the Green Dragon, which was just made 2 years ago in China.
I saw that.
Did you see that? About the attempts of local communities in China to prevent the building of a dam that was going to wreck the ecology of their social life in their community. And it definitely had an impact. It helped get the dam stopped. So, it's really interesting to look at the impact of these films. And also, I'm looking at the films not only from a point of view of social impact, but as pieces of production. I'm a film guy. I teach film production. And so I'm interested in seeing how the films got made, where the funding came from, how much they cost, how difficult, what obstacles they may have run into in making the films. And so I'm gearing this book towards an academic market, a market of filmmakers, and also the general public, because I think a lot of people would like to know what films are out there. What should I go see? What could I learn more about fracking or climate change or whatever, or the transition movement? So that's I'm trying to aim the book narrowly enough that it gets into some of the details about the filmmaking process, but broadly enough that people will go to the book just to find out what's out there.
We indeed, have an economic system right now that isn't properly pricing the fossil fuels. And we know that is a political challenge that we can't get to. Yet it shows, in the video you showed groups from Fairfax, Sebastopol, Mill Valley, Cotati, even in Portland, Oregon. So lots of groups who are thinking beyond the current paradigm. And these are either transition groups or sustainability groups that are focusing people and giving them a place to come and say, here we can talk about and do things. And so you captured a lot of, like, the co-housing at Frog Song in Cotati. Pam Hartwell Herrero, mayor of Fairfax now, started with sustainability and is bringing mainstream politics along. Yeah. So a lot of really exciting, positive stuff from people you capture in that video.
Yeah, I'll give a shout out to Pam if she's listening to this program. She's done a wonderful job both in nurturing Sustainable Fairfax as an organization and then, as Bernie just said, bringing it into the actual political realm. We need people in local government. Combs.
Julie Combs.
Julie Combs just was elected to the Santa Rosa City Council, and she's seen my film.
Yep.
And is aware about these issues. Yeah, I want to re-mention some of those names for anybody who's living in our local area here. There's a transition group in Cotati, in Sebastopol. You've got Sustainable Fairfax and Sustainable San Rafael and San Rafael. I am a member of a founding board right now, the founding core team for a new Sustainable Santa Rosa group. There's one being founded in Healdsburg. There's one over in Sonoma Valley. So these are already existing transition groups or sustainability groups that you can get involved with in your neighborhood if you are so moved.
I find we did have a transition initiative here a couple of years ago, but we had regular meetings, but it kind of petered out because I think we have so many other nonprofits that are doing community work, like West Marin Commons, and even though we don't call it transition, they're doing transition work.
I think that's really key because we discovered when we were trying to form the group that it isn't like we were bringing something new to this community at all.
Yes.
People have been recognizing the need to work in these various areas, and those are the things that are building resilience in the community. Yeah.
And I'm finding it's encouraging to me that instead of working in silos, they're coming together for regional meetings now to support each other.
One of the important missions of the transition movement is not to try to come into a community and take over everything. Their philosophy is very much to look at what's going on in the community, within the community, and act as a facilitator to get people working together. They're not trying to be king of the hill in terms of being the premier climate change peak oil organization in a community. They want to bring people together. People not only different sustainability organizations, but also different political viewpoints. It's important that everybody be included, whether right, left, or center.
And we have some of the founders here. The first president is Raven Gray. She lives here in Lagunitas and is interested in helping transition West Marin as needed and as we're able to sort of plug into anything else going on. And then also Carolyn Stanton, who's the executive director in the Sebastopol office. You have her in your video. And, you really have a lot of important local voices there. So, again, how can people take a look at your video?
The video,
YouTube.
The video is on YouTube. You said you were going to post a web link on your site, so I would refer you to this radio station site, I guess.
And I search on YouTube for Peak Oil and Transition. I'm sure we'll find it. Now, another place that I saw you had this video was on social media, on Facebook. Somebody posted it, and we're sharing it. And so I'm hoping that it'll, through social media, get a lot more viral attention. This is something where videos that are important like this, people will share, and they'll share it with folks that are like-minded.
Yeah,
and
I hope they will.
Yeah, I saw in the video Richard Heimberg even admit that at days he sort of acts like he's in denial of that reality, and I've come to believe that I have this bifurcated personality where I love having this discussion about the future and what we need to do and what it might be, etc. But that's not the world I really live in. The world I really live in is still very much hooked up to this oil-based economic system that is global with all its complexities and energy demands that I know will not sustain. And so that's a hard place for many of us to be kind of bipolar.
Yeah. Well, one thing that Andre Angelantoni says in the video, and he talks about the conflict between community resilience and individual resilience. And he says that a lot of people feel guilty if they're like stockpiling food or doing things like they're worrying about themselves instead of their community. And Andre points out that a community composed of resilient individuals is a resilient community.
Right.
If you're growing food in your backyard, that food can go to your neighbor, and maybe the neighbor has something that you can use, and so there's that's Andre has tried to focus more on in his website web classes that he teaches in post peak living website. He's tried to focus on individual resilience and helping people understand what they can do individually to make themselves more resilient.
And it's not just about hoarding, though. It's about learning skills that will serve you when the power goes off.
Yeah, the reskilling is one of the transition magic words. We need to reskill. We need to learn some of those skills that were lost from previous generations. And I think as unemployment kind of stagnates at this high level, or probably is going to even go considerably higher, people are going to need to learn skills. Learn skills that they can barter, services that they can barter for other people's goods and services. because I think it.
You know what the current paradigm tells you? Just take a loan out for like $30,000, government guaranteed. Sign up at one of these universities that are advertising on TV, and learn some more financial or computer skills.
Yeah.
So they're promoting sort of the skills that are, I think, going to be phased out. I keep believing that anything that requires electricity, you ought to question whether that's the skill you want to focus on. Skills where you don't need electricity, I think, are going to be more in use.
Well, I hope we can maintain the internet because the internet is the best alternative. Like web conferencing, for example, is the best alternative. Everybody doesn't have to fly to New York. Everybody can get in a conference from their living room, like here. So I hope that we can maintain some of those broad networks of communication, because they're going to be very helpful in the future to people if we can maintain those.
Well, we have Peter Asmus in our community, who is a specialist in studying about energy and electricity, and has written and talks on KWMR about various aspects of local energy. And, what we did with Marin Clean Energy was wrestle away sort of the decisions about sources of energy from the utility, but we haven't really wrestled the whole system away. And we need to, from his perspective, start taking advantage in electricity of having more islanding, where we could have a point raised electrical grid. It might not serve every home, but it could serve enough public spaces that people could come to maybe do the internet or do the other things that we're going to want electricity for. But this ubiquity of having 24/7 electricity. When Cuba had that experience we talked about, we heard from this young man that the power would come up for 2 hours, maybe 4 hours. You wouldn't really know. You have to prepare. So that changes how you prepare your life, knowing that it's not always there. And, we also, in terms of water, fortunately, in Marin, defeated the desal when all this rain was happening, but really need to start living within the watershed's budget of water. A lot of people aren't really ready for that yet. Yeah. And when it comes to fiber, of course, we don't yet allow the hemp, and we have very little fiber production. So people right now are still mostly buying clothes that are made in poor countries in Asia and Central America. So we definitely don't yet have the resilience. Yet we haven't lost it all. Fortunately, there are a lot of these skills. I know there's a lot of good carpenters out there that can work without power tools and get things built. There's good mechanics. There's certainly people who know to care for people. People know how to educate without electrical tools and all. And I share your wish to have it, but I think that the real resilience ultimately comes from being able to anticipate, what'll I do if the power is off and if the fuel trucks don't come over the hill anymore? Because, here we have one gas station, and if it goes out of business, and supplies no longer come over, our propane won't come here, our FedEx won't come here, and that would change life.
Oh, yeah. Big time.
Well, we're going to have to wind it down. I was wondering, John, if you had any final words?
I encourage folks to watch my video if you can. And I would encourage everybody to get involved in your community at whatever level you feel is appropriate. Some people want to run for public office. Some people just want to get to know their neighbors better. And at whatever level you feel appropriate, try to get involved in preparing your community for these hard times that are coming. Because it really does take a village, in Hillary Clinton's words, not just to educate our kids, but to function as individuals. And I think that there are a lot of. I'll end on a positive note, as folks in the transition movement like to say. Going back, even if we just had to go back to the 19th century, and I don't think it's going to be that bad, but we've lost a lot of things in our society. We've lost the closeness to our neighbors. We've lost the ability to do creative things with our spare time, to get together for the barn dances. I mean, there are lots of things in the society that we've left behind that were good for our communities and for ourselves as individuals. There's reason for hope, even if we live in an economy with much less resources than we've got now, and with much less consumer activity and so on. There's a lot of good stuff that we can derive just from working together and making good use of our own time. So I would encourage people to be hopeful, to be realistic, to plan for the future in a realistic manner, but also to be hopeful that wherever we wind up in terms of energy consumption, there's going to be a lot of good stuff there for us as communities and as individuals.
Well, John Duvall, professor, PhD at Dominican University, thanks so much for being our guest today, and we wish you nothing but success with your teaching, with your writing, your screenplay, your film productions. Keep up the great work. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.